Thank you very much, Julie. And thank you all for coming and your interest. As Julie explained, I'm going to talk about the IBLI program, the Index-Based Livestock Insurance Program. I'll start by just giving you a brief motivation of why we developed this thing we now call IBLI. What was the contextual setting? What are the key issues that the pastoral communities and agro-pastoral communities in a particular area of East Africa face? What is IBLI? What is index-based insurance more broadly? I'm going to hazard the guess most of you don't really know. You may have heard the term. I'll try to explain it without getting too technical. And then I'll spend a lot of time on the last part here, why it's an imperfect product. And I emphasize that because as one of the researchers who's been involved in promoting index insurance for a particular context, one of my real concerns is people mistakenly think it's some sort of silver bullet. It can help with very specific things, and it's an incomplete answer to very specific questions. It is not a panacea. It's not a solution to all the problems these populations face. So I'll emphasize why it's an imperfect product, mainly from a caveat emptor perspective, so that those of you who might think about this as one more tool to use in particular sorts of developing country settings can be appropriately cautious about what might be its Achilles heel, what might be its weaknesses. But the big takeaway is, in spite of its many weaknesses, we have a raft. This is almost without question the most evaluated index insurance product in the world. And all of the studies consistently find the same thing. The people who take up this product are better off for buying that insurance. So the ending note, after a lot of cautions about why it doesn't do everything everybody would like it to do and how hard it is to actually make it work, is that it is a positive product. It's actually contributing something very tangibly to these populations. So let me start by setting context. In the dry lands, I'll sometimes call them the ASAL, the arid and semi-arid lands, you find that Kenyans and Ethiopians working in this setting often use the term ASAL. In the ASAL, people rely primarily on extensive grazing of herds. Multiple species, cattle and camels are dominant as the large ruminants, but a lot of sheep and goats as well. And they rely primarily on extensive grazing because rainfall is relatively low in volume. We're talking about places that all have less than 1,000 millimeters of rainfall a year, some places less than 200 millimeters of rainfall a year. And rainfall is so scattered in space and so unreliable in time that crop agriculture is a pretty perilous enterprise. People do try to grow crops, especially in the higher semi-arid areas, 600 to 900 millimeters of rainfall, they take a shot, but they often wind up having crop that really just provide enough biomass to be animal feed and not enough for a harvest that would generate food for a family for any sustained period of time. So that's the setting. I'll show you some pictures of herders in a little bit, but in that setting, the crucial thing that drives the well-being of a household is the size of its herd, because there aren't a whole lot of non-agricultural enterprises. So what we really want to know about people's long-run well-being is, if I have a herd of a given size today, 10 animals, 20 animals, what's the trajectory of that herd? What's the herd dynamics? That's telling me something about my wealth dynamics. Those of us with some white hair, every now and then log on and check what our retirement portfolio looks like and what are the projections for future years. We're worried about our wealth dynamics because that's what we're going to be dependent upon soon to sustain ourselves. And it's not a whole lot different for pastoralists. They don't log on to a TIA-CREF website. They go count animals. And they think about what are the upcoming seasons and how likely can I keep my herd alive. In that setting, a crucial thing to understand is if I take the animals I hold today, depicted on the horizontal axis, as the logarithm of herd size, so don't worry those of you who don't think in log terms, and on the vertical axis, the herd size at some future date tomorrow, the 45-degree line, because these are scaled the same, are the points where today and tomorrow have exactly the same expected value. So if I have 10 animals today, I expect to have 10 animals tomorrow. If when I plot the herd dynamics, it hits that 45-degree line. So using data, this particular study uses 17-year herd history data from individual herding households in southern Ethiopia. When we map out the herd dynamics at both 1-year frequency, the dashed lines, and 10-year frequencies, the solid lines, you find a striking pattern. This sort of lazy S shape that crosses that 45-degree line. The 45-degree line we refer to as dynamic equilibrium, meaning today and tomorrow have the same value. And it crosses from below, from beneath, from above, from beneath, and from above again. And without getting too deep into the technical side of that, what this is telling us is in this low level, this is a pretty stable equilibrium. If I start off with one animal, so log of 1 equals 0, if I start off with one milk cow and I lose it, there's a good chance I can get somebody to replenish my milk cow. A humanitarian agency shows up and gives me one animal in a restocking project. One of my neighbors or extended family gives me an animal, and I'll bounce back to that equilibrium pretty quickly. But if I have one and I grow up to 3 or 4, I'm going to have a hard time keeping the extra 2 or 3 beyond the 1. And the reason is that at a very small herd size, I'm sedentarized. I can't really go on long migrations. And this is an area of very scattered rainfall. Water and forage are available in patches. And you can't sustain, the carrying capacity of a small area is relatively low. And when you have a settlement with lots of people there, each household can really only afford to sustain, on average, one animal over time. Once you get beyond that, you start to overgraze and drive that local ecosystem into collapse. So when you have a sedentarized population, you wind up pretty quickly with a one milk cow equilibrium. But when you get bigger, once you get up to teens as a herd size, and this is in what we call tropical livestock units, think of it as cows, just a way of aggregating by metabolic weight across species. So let's just think about this as cattle. The Braun would like to think of it, the population studied here would like to think about it as cattle. Once you get into the teens or beyond, now you can herd split. And what I mean by herd split is the following. Households in these settings maintain permanent settlements. They're not truly nomadic households. Many generations back, many of them were, but these households have permanent residences. But if you can hold a lot of your wealth on the hoof, this is the highest return investment available in this setting, and you know that you can't sustain them in the local agroecosystem right around the village, but there is grass and water at some distance, 20, 40, 200, 350 kilometers away. These households will take very long seasonal treks. You take the dry herd and a few lactating animals and all the able-bodied adults, and you trek them. You leave for a period of weeks or months until the base camp, your permanent residence, has enough forage and water available to sustain the whole herd again, which seasonally is almost always true, but is never true throughout a season, except in a very few rare places with deep well complexes and permanent water. Now, the crucial thing there is that you have to split your herd, and you split your herd because while all the cattle can walk, not all the humans can trek long distances. Very young children, the infirm, the elderly, somebody who actually has a job in a town, somebody who's working for a local NGO or church or something, they need to stay resident. So they split the herds and the base camp stays behind, typically with a very small number of lactating animals to provide food for the family, oftentimes a little bit of milk that can be sold in the local market on a daily basis. And the rest of the herd, most of the herd migrates. If you can herd split and you can migrate, you can sustain a much bigger herd. You can sustain an equilibrium herd size in the order of 35 to 50 head of cattle. So 1 versus 35 or 50. These are radically different things. If you have 35 or 50 cattle as a pastoralist, you're well off. People don't think of you as poor, even though you or I, looking at many folks from these households, would think that the material conditions in which they live look poor. They don't think of themselves as poor at all. They can sustain themselves quite well, thank you. But the crucial thing here is there's some tipping point. There's some critical herd size threshold at which you cease to be mobile. You can no longer effectively herd split and maintain a big pastoral rotational grazing scheme, and now you become sedentarized. And moving from this equilibrium up here where I can keep 40, 50 animals down to this equilibrium where I'm stuck with just one is catastrophic. This lower equilibrium is what we call a poverty trap, because it's very hard to recover from here. You need a discrete movement. You can't have just a small marginal change. If you give me 2 goats and I've just got 1 milk cow, I'm not suddenly a migratory pastoralist. That marginal change in my herd size has no effect on my equilibrium behavior. I do not suddenly adopt a transhuman migratory lifestyle. If, by contrast, you can give me 20 cattle on top of my 1, then new game. I'm going to change what I do. But these big discrete changes, what some of the economics literature is called the big push, not marginal changes, big ones, are the only ones that can transform your optimal strategies and your well-being. And we've replicated that basic finding. This is from an old 2004 paper written with one of my former graduate 2 of my former graduate students, actually. We've replicated this with other data from the same area of southern Ethiopia and from a neighboring area of northern Kenya. These sorts of poverty trap dynamics in herding populations in East Africa very clearly exist. The crucial thing here is what causes this. As we unpack the data, the key is droughts. The key is major droughts. And the reason is this. In a good year, virtually any pastoralist can grow his or her herd. You know, if the rain is plentiful, grass is everywhere, even I could probably keep my cow alive. And trust me, I've been told multiple times I'm not a very good herder. They kind of laugh at me. They're like, how are you so fat if you're such a bad herder? That's a direct quote, actually. So, you know, it's just, again, different markers of wealth, right? But if I am facing a difficult year and I'm not a very good herder, I can't keep my animals alive. But if you give me more animals, I have a better shot at keeping them alive. And the most talented herders can make a go of it. If you just give them half a dozen or 8, they can make it work. The least competent herders, it doesn't matter how big a herd you give them. Your son is going to lose it all over time. It's just a matter of how many years it takes before he loses the entire family wealth. That's how this system works. And the reason that people lose their animals are drought events and all the package of things that come with droughts. Outbreaks of disease, natural predators increasingly go after domestic stock because the wild ungulates are less plentiful because their populations are hurt by drought. When some people lose their animals, they decide that they'll go get a herd the quick way at the end of a weapon, and so banditry increases. There are a whole host of things that happen, but it's all got a common driver of a drought event. So droughts really are the things that create these dynamics. This paper that's just coming out later this year goes into that, explaining, I think convincingly, that droughts are the driver. So if poverty traps are something that concerns us in this context, and droughts are the drivers of poverty traps, we need something to address droughts. That's the big takeaway from a body of research a bunch of us did for about a decade. And moreover, this problem is growing more acute. Climate change in this setting is meaning more frequent and arguably more intense droughts. So using very similar data, when we simulate the herd dynamics with data and the current drought rate, if the frequency of drought is about 6.3%, 6.4% of years, you'll have 250 millimeters or less of rain a year. We just call that a drought. That's pretty low rainfall. And this black line is what we generate through simulation and data off of the current climate regime, the recent history. And it replicates almost exactly the graphic I just showed you. It's a little smoother. But this allows us to unpack and say, what happens if the frequency of drought changes? If climate change means that we have more frequent drought, double the frequency of drought to about 12.8%, that herd dynamic, this is the same graphic as before, that herd dynamic collapses. The 95% confidence band only touches that 45-degree line at the lower equilibrium. The system is poised on a knife's edge. It really will collapse, we believe, without significant structural change if you just double the frequency of droughts. If 1 year out of 8 you have a really extreme drought, rather than 1 year out of 15, 16 you have a really severe drought, we've got a problem. Conversely, if we somehow imagine that droughts became less frequent, you would almost lose the low-level equilibrium and everybody would be in the West Texas equilibrium, where it might be dry pretty regularly, but you can keep a big herd pretty much indefinitely. So this is all very dependent upon climate change, which also means that if that's the underlying dynamic without change, but climate is changing, we need to change something else if we don't want to see the system collapse and virtually all of this population fall into that poverty trap. So how do people respond to this right now? There are two main tools people use. Emergency response agencies will restock herds. Drought hits, I lose my animal, somebody shows up, gives me a replacement animal. That's fine for that one milk cow equilibrium. It doesn't work to get anybody back to the transhumant migratory grazing equilibrium because nobody's giving out 10 or 12 cows at a time. And it's incredibly hard to target who's right at the margin where one more cow will make them mobile and it wouldn't otherwise. So that's not to say herd restocking is a bad thing. For those who've lost everything, giving them one is a good thing and they can sustain it. But giving people more than one cow in this setting is actually a money-losing proposition. Given you can't spend money on everything, that's a really bad use of the money. Food aid is the dominant response, but food aid is really slow and inefficient. Anyone have a guess at what the median delivery time is for US emergency food aid response? Meaning from the moment the humanitarian agency, CARE, Save the Children, whoever you like, puts in a request to USAID for emergency food aid to the time it arrives in port ready for distribution, how long do we wait? How much of the calendar elapses? Dave's guessing 12 months. You're a little too cynical, Dave. No, it's bad, it's not that bad. 6 to 8 months? You're also a little bit cynical, not as bad as Dave. 4.5 months. The median delivery time is 4.5 months. Half of the deliveries of emergency food aid take more than that. That is a very long time to wait. Kids die because of this, because it takes so long to get response in there. And moreover, there's a really core issue here that some of us term the social protection paradox. If we only provide assistance to those who have now become destitute, and you have a system like this where there are those unstable equilibria, those tipping points, my herd collapses beyond that one intermediate range, and I'm going to collapse into the poverty trap, the number of those in the poverty trap will grow without bound. Because we're only protecting the very poorest, and the non-poor who might be viable as transhuman pastoralists are getting shocked into the poor, destitute equilibrium, and they now increasingly compete with the original poor for very scarce resources. So those who were poorest to begin with are over time made worse off by our failure to provide a safety net to those who could be viable on their own if we just intervened at the right moments to prevent their collapse into the poverty trap. And that's the social protection paradox, that we have this instinct we want to help the very poorest, and we should. But one of the things we have to do to help the very poorest is to make sure we protect the resources that we target to them by also ensuring that their ranks don't grow excessively, i.e. when a short-term intervention to just get people back on their feet and off the dole, if you will, those interventions are really important to people who will depend for an extended period of time on social protection programs. So it's a bit of a paradox, but we demonstrate in this paper that over time, poverty rates actually fall if temporarily you divert some resources to these sorts of social safety nets to keep the viable non-poor from becoming permanently poor. And insurance is one of the ways you can do this, because something that provides a transfer at a particular moment in time when people have suffered some sort of catastrophic loss, that's what we call insurance. So the question is, how do we design insurance to work for this sort of thing? And it can do several things. The most obvious, as I've described it, is it can prevent the downward slide. The drought comes, my animals die, somebody gives me a payout, I can buy new animals, then I don't have to suffer that herd size collapse. It can also crowd in investment. The risk-adjusted return on animals now is higher if they're insured. So at the margin, I should be investing in animals. I should be accumulating productive capital. And that will, over time, increase standards of living by increasing incomes. It can also crowd in access to credit and savings because, for example, in this area, the main thing people are selling is livestock. The main market for their livestock are terminal city markets in Addis Ababa to the north and Nairobi to the south. But the herders themselves can't usually evacuate animals there. It's a very long trek. So they typically are selling to traders who have lorries, who have trucks. And the lorry owners and the traders take a huge margin. If you look at the terminal price in Nairobi versus the upcountry price in Marsabit or Moyale, the difference is huge. Typically, the herders get less than half of the terminal market value for the exact same animal delivered just a few days later. That's a pretty good return on owning a truck. So the natural thing to do should be form a herders cooperative, buy a truck. We can do this ourselves. We can capture the profit. We're all better off. But nobody's got the cash around to buy a truck. You need a loan. And what bank is going to give you a loan when your collateral is the livestock who might die in the drought? If you have an insurance policy against the drought that the bank knows would give you the capital to pay them back if you can't service the loan, there's the chance of crowding in credit. We haven't seen it happen on trucks for herder co-ops yet. We're actually in discussions with one bank right now about developing a product like that. But we have seen examples of this in other settings where insurance crowds in access to credit. And as I said, it can let us focus humanitarian resources on the needy by providing what I'll describe as a market-mediated product to help the middle class, if you will, not fall into the ranks of the destitute. The key is, can you do it? So why don't these products exist already? They don't exist because it's hard. The first thing is, think about how your own insurance worked. How many of you have ever had a fender bender and called your insurance company to get your car evaluated and get a payment, or suffered flood damage in your basement or something like that? Okay, a number of you are raising your hands. Many of you who have suffered these things are embarrassed too. And so you aren't raising your hands. That's okay. We've all been there. So what happens? The insurance company sends an agent, a claims adjuster, who looks at your vehicle or takes it to a shop or talks to a shop that has looked at your vehicle, or they come to your house, they want pictures of the damage, and they verify your loss. That's a really expensive operation. It works for your $300,000 house or your $25,000 car. It's not such a good solution for your $8 goat or your $100 cow, especially if your goat and your cow are 400 kilometers without Macadam Road from the insurance company and without good cell phone service. So there is no good way to go verify loss. So the inability to verify loss cost effectively, the high transactions cost of claims adjustment, effectively crowd out most traditional insurance in these settings. There are also problems of what's called moral hazard. If I know I've got insurance on this herd and a lion comes and is ready to attack my herd, I would probably be a little less likely to take on the lion. You'd be surprised how many of these guys will take on lions to protect their herds. That's called moral hazard. I'm willing to take on increased risk because I know somebody is going to pay me if I have a loss. And so it changes our behavior. It makes us a little lazier. That's a real problem with many insurance contracts. My son's godfather, famously, we used to travel together regularly. He would rent a car, and his usual line was, "Hey, it's just a rental," meaning I would never do this to my own car, but hey, let's drive over that curb, no big deal, it's a rental. You don't take care of things that aren't yours the same way. That's called moral hazard. There's another problem called adverse selection. Let me not get bogged down in it. But the point is, conventional insurance of the sort you and I know from our homes and our cars just does not work well in this setting. Index insurance is an attempt to find something that can work. It's a variation on traditional insurance. The key first thing to understand is we do not insure an individual's loss. If Richard's got a herd of animals and he owns an insurance policy, we are not asking whether his animals died. And that is really crucial to understand. Index insurance, as opposed to usual indemnity insurance, decouples the losses from the individual policyholder. Rather, what you're interested in is some index, something you can measure that tells you a proxy for Richard's likely losses. So if we know what the rainfall is in his town, and we know that rainfall and herd survival are strongly correlated, knowing the rainfall gives me a reasonable proxy for whether his animals likely died or what share of his animals likely died. That's an index. So we look for indices, things that are strongly correlated with losses but are easy to measure, that the data are available in near real time, they're cheap, they're publicly available so anyone can check. It can't be manipulated by the insurer or the insured. Remote sensing platforms do a lot of this. We use satellite-based remote sensing data. You can use average area yield if you have regular crop cutting exercises by an agriculture ministry. There are a lot of ways to do this. The point being, it's something that represents what's happening on average in the local area. It's not the individual experience. That decouples that claims adjustment problem. It also ends the moral hazard problem. Because if Richard owns IBLI, he has an IBLI policy, and the rain doesn't fall in his village, he's going to get paid whether or not he keeps his animals alive. So he's better off exerting every effort to keep his animals alive. He will take on the lion. I might not, but he will. So you preserve the incentives and you reduce the cost by using the index. A couple of key things. The index needs to be objectively verifiable, low cost, real time, not manipulable. I already said these things. So it can obviate the problems of traditional insurance because I think I've already said all these things. Yeah, let me not get into adverse selection right now. So it could be used in principle to solve this catastrophic drought risk problem and accelerate herd recovery. But there are a few things you need. One, you need good data. In a world where there are lots of satellites above us taking increasingly frequent high-resolution pictures, this is getting easier. In a world where cell phone coverage is becoming quickly universal, you can do this more than we used to be able to do it. But you have to have also time series data that goes back, because ultimately you have to be able to estimate the frequency with which loss events occur. It's not just a matter of measuring today. You have to have enough history where I can convince an insurance company what the risk of loss is if they sell a product. Second thing, and this is the big one, is we need to worry about what we call uncovered basis risk. Basis risk is the gap between the rainfall measurement and Richard's herd's losses. The two will be correlated, we hope, but they will almost never be perfectly correlated. So there's some chance that the rain was just fine, but the lion got his herd anyway, even in a good year. And if the rain didn't fall, so the insurance company doesn't believe there should have been high losses in the area, he's stuck with his losses with no insurance payment. That's an uncovered loss. That's uncovered basis risk. It also has the opposite effect, that in a really bad year, when everybody else got wiped out, but every one of his animals stayed alive, he still gets a payout anyway. So he's just getting windfall gains when he didn't suffer any losses. Those two false positive, false negative events are basis risk. And one of the key weaknesses of lots of index insurance is if we don't know what the basis risk is. If we can't actually measure how closely correlated the index is with the actual losses of the people who we're trying to insure. And this matters because insurance protects against losses. If I called this index-based lottery tickets, I doubt many of you would have come here to listen to what it's about. But it is a lottery ticket if the index is uncorrelated with the loss. Then it's just like going and buying a scratch-off, where I just paid some money for something. Randomly, I might get a payout, and I might not, and it's utterly uncorrelated with the rest of the experience of my life. There are a lot of index insurance products that look distressingly like lottery tickets. So that's one of the big cautions. It's important to be able to design a product off of data that let us know something about basis risk and then to monitor. That's one of the reasons we did this project. We had, from the project that I described at the outset, where we could figure out catastrophic drought risk, we had long-term herd history data. We could figure out, by backfitting a designed product, how would it have performed, and we could actually design it off household loss data so as to consciously minimize risk. basis risk. As I'll show you in a few minutes, even having done that, there's still a lot of design risk in here. There's still imperfections. Even when you set out to do it perfectly, you won't get there. You have to preserve incentives for the various players. I won't spend much time on this, but you need to work with the private sector. Universities aren't insurance agents, so we have to develop stuff that insurance companies will underwrite. Reinsurers in Europe will pick up most of the risk. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're taking drought risk in East Africa, moving it to insurance companies in capital cities who sell most of it to the capital market. So most of the drought risk faced by herders in Ethiopia and Kenya is actually on the books of Swiss and German and French reinsurers. So we're literally using the global capital market to address that poverty trap catastrophic risk problem. You need to establish effective demand. We're about to show up in villages where 40% of the adults can neither read nor add two single-digit numbers. And we're about to start selling them European put options, because that's exactly what we've designed. That should make you very nervous. At least it should raise some ethical alarms for you that, do they know what they're buying? And if they don't know what they're buying and they're spending real money on a product and they're poor, are you hurting them? And a basic do no harm principle should mean that we really need to exert ourselves to make sure people understand what they're buying. So a big extension activity was involved in this. We developed these little games, we had comic books, we had these Baran orators who were kind of like troubadours, told the story of IBLI in local language, all kinds of stuff, partly to try to figure out what actually worked. Most of it doesn't work as effectively as you'd like it to, but people do learn about the product and their knowledge does matter to uptake. And then you need a low-cost delivery vehicle. Cell phones are very helpful for this. That's the takeaway there. So what's the contract? So the IBLI contract, the original contract, is designed as a product that takes a very specific index, the normalized difference vegetation index, a measure of the green reflectance off the surface of the Earth, off of a satellite-based platform, originally AVHRR, for those of you who know remote sensing, now MODIS. And it uses that time series of measures of very specific spots on the ground to build an index. We sell the product, the insurance company sells the product just before the rains begin. This is a bimodal rainfall region, so rains usually start in early March. You sell the product in January and February just before the rains begin. It's a 12-month contract. It covers the first long rains and long dry season, and then the short rains and short dry season that follows. It's a 12-month contract. There's a second sales window just before the second annual rainy season. And at the end of what is usually the end of the dry season, so at the end of February and at the end of September, there are payouts based on the index reading. So when you get to September 30th, if the index shows in the original design that herd losses were 15% or more in your area, you got a payout. So you took your little policy, I'll show you a receipt in a second, and you'd get a payout. If you were on the payment system, you'd get it right on your phone. And if the index wasn't above the strike level, above this 15% trigger, you wouldn't get a payout. And the amount of your payout depends upon how much you chose to insure. If I didn't buy anything, I get zero. If I bought a lot, if I put a lot of my herd under insurance, then I get a big payout. Questions about that? So the key things here are it's in a very specific spot in space. I buy my contract in a particular place for a particular one-year period. The index is based off satellite measures of range vegetation. There are 2 candidate payout periods. And I can't start buying once the rainy season has begun. Once I can observe that it's a drought, there's no rain, time to buy the policy, I can't do that. That's why we bound the periods of sale. Okay?
Do I get 2 checks or what?
Can you get 2 checks on this? If there are 2 successive droughts, you get 2 checks. So it's all priced to allow for multiple indemnities. So the original pilot, which we began in 2010, was in northern Kenya. So this is right up the Ethiopian borders right here. You'll see in another map in a second. So we had several different sub-districts within the Marsabit, at that time, Marsabit district. People would, here's an example of a voucher issued off of a little handheld point of sale device like the thing that the waiter shows up at your restaurant table with, swipes your card, out comes the receipt. It's exactly the same thing. So this fellow, Belgalo Guio, bought 4 cattle's worth of IBLI for 975 Kenyan shillings. The total value was double that because he'd gotten a randomized discount voucher worth 50% of premium, and he bought it on the 15th of February 2011. And Equity Bank was the agent selling that particular insurance policy. So we ran this with several different insurers. We had 3 different commercial insurers offering contracts in different places. Takful is a Sharia-compliant insurer, so we developed a Sharia-compliant version for the Muslim populations in the Northeast. Oromi Insurance Company in Ethiopia, and as I said before, they've pushed most of the risk out to offshore reinsurers. Lots. Mm-hmm. They have been relatively frequent. So climate change is definitely affecting this area. My belief is climate change is definitely affecting this area. It doesn't affect the pricing much right now because keep in mind that this is based off of 30 years of data. So one more year of a bad year updates, but it only updates as one of 30 observations. So it's not radically changing pricing yet. Over longer time periods, you would think climate change is going to affect the pricing a lot. There are all kinds of implementation challenges with this that I won't get into. I'm happy to answer questions at the end. But suffice to say, the design is the easy part. Actually implementing it in the field is the hard part. And some of you probably just thought that the design sounded hard. We married this whole thing with a very careful monitoring and evaluation plan. You can see Ethiopia and Kenya. The Ethiopian insurance region is the very southern part, the Boran Plateau, for those of you who know the area. And northern Kenya, the initial pilot area was in Marsabit. Now it's actually nationwide. The Kenyan government introduced the Kenya Livestock Insurance Program, which now provides subsidized product for households below a particular wealth threshold in all the arid and semi-arid counties. So we launched in Kenya in 2010. A massive drought hit the region in 2011. This worked exactly as it was designed. Payouts happened. People, like, they had these cool songs they sang about IBLI, which was kind of fun. So we then launched a variant of the product in Ethiopia in 2012 after the success of the pilot in Kenya, and it's now gone to other places in Kenya. But we overlaid the product design and commercial distribution with sampling of the colored regions here. So you can see that this is just traditional random sampling. We built in randomized incentives to households. Every survey round, they get discount coupons. So this time, Terry would get 20% off. The next season's contract, he'd have a discount for 50% off. The one after that, 0. So we could look at how price responsive people are, but we could also induce more people to try it. So we get a large enough sample, we could evaluate whether it really helps or not. And we likewise randomized what sort of extension exposure they got. Were they given comic books? Were they played these radio stories? Were they participating in games or nothing at all? The product is highly imperfect. I told you this before, but let me just illustrate it in data. This is one of those this is the smallest of those Marsabit units. And this shows you 8 different seasons in which the product could pay off in the 15% strike level. So 2 of the 8 seasons, it would have paid off. So this is actually projecting backwards before when the product was really offered. So in that particular location, in 2 of the 8 seasons, a policy would have paid. But for each of those 8 seasons, look at the dispersion of individual household losses. So the average is only that. It is a central tendency with a lot of dispersion. A lot of people, this was a year with negligible average losses, but you had people who lost their whole herd, who would get nothing, no payout at all. That's the Achilles heel of this. That's the uncovered basis risk problem. So the means depicted by the mean in these box and whisker plots ignores all the distribution around it, which is very great, and even for the same household. So this is a plot showing each household's individual average, they're arrayed by their average livestock loss over those 8 seasons, and it shows you the intertemporal spread that household faced. Nobody loses the same amount every period, but the fluctuation here is huge over time just for single households. And the average rates can get to be pretty considerable. This is the distribution of the average rates. I mean, you have folks who, on average, were losing a third of their herd every season. Their herd just kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. They were in that lower part of that S-shaped curve. They were collapsing to that 1 milk cow equilibrium. So this is the Achilles heel, that you're paying the average, but there's all this dispersion in any given period for a household, and there's a huge amount of dispersion over time for any given household. The product itself, the animation here is off. The product itself as designed does okay, not great. So this is a plot that shows you the true mortality rate in that location, in that division, and the index value, which should be the predicted mortality rate. If this was perfect, they would all line up on that dashed 45-degree line, because they would the index would be the same as the realized mortality rate. You can see that there is not a single dot on that line, so the index never perfectly predicts livestock mortality, which maybe should be discouraging, but it's like hand grenades and horseshoes, close counts in insurance. And what you should take away from this, when under the 15% true loss, blue is the regression line, it's almost invariant. That's where you don't want to pay out because there's a certain amount of churn at a very low level in relatively good years. You don't want there to be payouts in those years, but we got a lot of false positives. We actually had almost half of the location season combinations when there should have been no payout, there was, or there would have been. Some of this is projected backwards. Because of the design risk, because even though we fit the contracts to the household data, you're still only using a few years and the whole system is changing, and so you can't possibly predict correctly. And this design risk isn't about the dispersion of households within a year, it's getting the average for that location and year wrong. So this is what is in principle correctable, it's just hard to do so. You can correct them after the fact, hard to do so initially. The good news is that above the strike, where you really want to have a payout, the index is very strongly positively correlated with the true mortality rates, but it undersells. You, on average, were not paying out as much as people lost. So it's got a real gap to it, a highly imperfect product. Because of the dispersion I showed you before, even with this product, households are still holding 60 to 75% of the risk, because most of the risk is idiosyncratic. It's not covariate. It's not the average for that community. Most of the basis risk is household specific and random. We can't even target it. We can't predict out of sample accurately who were we going to underpay, because if you could do that, you could put riders in to correct for that kind of a flaw. So it doesn't seem to be correctable. And there's also a lot of spatial variation in this. There are particular areas where you miss a little more frequently than others. None of which is terribly surprising, but is a big caution, because this is probably the most carefully designed index product that I'm aware of. One of the only ones, the only one at this time that was designed off actual household data. Now we start to get towards that question of, so is it a good product in the sense of, does it actually help people? One simple way we usually think about this in risk analysis is something called stochastic dominance. If I can reduce the variance and increase the mean, even for a stochastic payout, I'm always better off, because I have a lower probability of the worst possible draws, a higher probability of good draws, and on average, I'm going to do okay. IBLI does not stochastically dominate not being insured. That would have been the simple, nice answer. We could have just wiped our hands, walked away, and said, this is always better. The uninsured livestock survival rate is necessarily bounded between 0 and 1. If I don't own insurance, I haven't paid a premium, and I can't get an indemnity payout, I can only have, I can't have more than all my herd die, a 0% survival rate, and I can't have more than all my herd survive, 100%. We're leaving out reproduction here. With insurance, you can actually get negative survival rates. If I lost 100% of my herd and I paid an insurance premium and it didn't pay out, I am unambiguously worse off than I had not bought the insurance. That is a possibility, and that alone is enough to mean insurance can't stochastically dominate being uninsured. You also have an even bigger share of people who get windfall gains. They keep all their herd alive and they get a payment because they're really good herders, and it was a tough year in this area, but they were lucky or skilled or both. So this is telling us that we can't make a really simple assessment over whether people are actually better off with this highly imperfect product. And this all comes from that basis risk problem. If there was no basis risk, this would be a no-brainer. We see people taking it up. So the fact that it's imperfect and that we spend a lot of time educating people on the imperfection of this product did not scare them away. So we see that in both Borana, southern Ethiopia, and Marsabit, northern Kenya, the very first product offering period, we had almost 30% of people buying a policy, putting their own cash out there. We weren't giving it away for free. They had to pay something. They had to have some skin in the game. And the adoption curves keep trending up as you increase the number of sales periods. These breaks occur because of implementation problems. The agents never sold the product one season in northern Kenya, that sort of thing. But you see that these adoption curves are doing okay. I think plant breeders in the room might be happy with 40 and 50% adoption rates on a new innovation. But the disadoption rates are also high. People try it, they buy the product, they think about it, and they say, I'll pass next time, thank you. So there are high rates of experimentation with the product, high rates of disadoption of the product having experimented with it, which is a sign this is attractive enough for people to try, not so overwhelmingly and universally attractive that everybody, once they try it, will inevitably stick with it. You know, unlike car insurance in New York State, where you're compelled by law to buy it, nobody's compelled to buy IBLI. With free choice, disadoption rates tell us a lot about how much better off are they. So let me quickly talk about, so what drives the uptake? Whoops. So a couple things about uptake. Price matters. It matters less than you might think. For those who are economists, demand is actually surprisingly price inelastic here. So the demand curve slopes down rather sharply in price. Design risk and idiosyncratic risk matter, especially once we expose people to extension messaging. We have them play games where they learn that the product could pay out even if you don't have a loss, and it might not pay out when you do have a loss. The better they understand that, the less likely they are to buy, and the bigger the risk involved, the increasingly less likely they are to buy. So people seem to understand the imperfection of the product and build it into their own demand patterns. Understanding of the product matters. Surprisingly, we can stimulate improved knowledge, but it doesn't wind up having independent effects on uptake. As you would expect, people with bigger herds are more likely to buy livestock insurance. They've got more capital at risk in the event of a drought. Having cash available increases your likelihood of buying the product. I skipped adverse selection before, so let me not deal with it now. So one thing we were a little concerned about and wondering about, you know, these are very patriarchal societies. Herding is, by and large, considered a man's game. So we were very worried that this could be a product that might help men and could, in unanticipated ways, hurt women. Those of you know Liz Bajan, her master's thesis was studying gender differentiation and uptake of IBLI in southern Ethiopia. She spent a bunch of time there. And one of the things she finds in her work, and we've replicated in other work in both Ethiopia and Kenya, is that it turns out there actually isn't a gender difference in the propensity to uptake or to benefit from the product, which is sort of a happy accident because it's not like we designed it. It was a gender blind rather than a gender neutral design. But we're pleased that it wound up actually being gender neutral in both demand and outcomes. So the part that really matters is, so does it actually help? And the answer is unambiguously yes. In spite of all these imperfections, in spite of all of my hand-wringing about whether we were selling lottery tickets to poor people, it turns out that those who bought policies are better off. And we can make these statements as causal assertions because of the design. We were building in randomized controlled trials of who was getting incentivized to take up this product. And we can use that randomization to make very clear causal statistical statements. For those interested in the technical details, I can talk with you after. You can read the papers. But the takeaways are those who buy invest more in the herds that they have, which makes some sense if you think you can sustain herds for a longer period of time because you're more likely to be able to have a herd, you'll invest in it. So we see higher veterinary, especially preventive care. We see higher milk output and milk income per cow for the households that had insurance. We see higher incomes caused by having insurance, part of which is this is that investment effect, not just preventing losses. It's that people double down on investing in what is now a higher risk-adjusted rate of return for their animal. We see that children's mid-upper arm circumferences are larger for the households that have bought. And we see a significantly reduced probability of people selling their livestock on really adverse terms in the midst of drought. These distress sales only compound the losses they're suffering as they offload animals at bargain basement prices. We see confusing or mixed evidence around what effects does it have on a herd size. So one of the things we wondered about was if I insure the herd and its risk-adjusted returns increase, it sounds like an attractive asset, I should invest more. But if I never had insurance available to me and the way I insured was through what economists call precautionary savings, I held excessive amounts of livestock to insure against loss, and now I have a substitute insurance product that's more efficient, then you could see a drop in herd size if precautionary savings dominated risk-adjusted returns, or an increase in herd size, vice versa. And it turns out on opposite sides of the border, we got one of each of those. So there's not an unambiguous result on herd size. Whoops. We see that there's a reduction in herding effort. We put GPS collars on cattle in Ethiopia so we can track how much herders are actually moving their animals when they're insured or not insured. When we ask people about their well-being, we find that very clear statements that they are better off without going into the statistics of it. We can identify a buyer's remorse effect. When I bought a contract that didn't pay out and it lapses, we can identify that people feel a little bit of regret over that, but they feel much more comfort with having insurance in force so that the two net out for insurance still to be attractive even if I know I'll regret it when my insurance doesn't pay out and I paid that big premium. I've regularly had that feeling. I don't know about some of you. It also seems to crowd in informal transfers. People help each other out a little bit more when we're injecting capital in during these catastrophic droughts. And when we do the benefit cost analysis and compare it to the cash transfer program that runs in the same area of northern Kenya at the same time, we find that the marginal impact, they both have a very strongly positive greater than 1 benefit to cost ratio, but the marginal benefit cost ratio for insurance is 6 to 45 times higher than a cash transfer. Basically, you're leveraging private capital to provide catastrophic relief. This should, at the margin, be much more attractive because a lot of it's a fixed cost operation, not variable cost. So the next question is, where do we go? An undergraduate and postdoc of mine and I work together on putting together a targeting map using some characterization tools. Ex post, it turns out Ethiopia and Kenya were the right places to do this. The next best places to do this are South Africa, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And we're actually right now, we were just in Niger in January doing some initial scoping, trying to get something launched there. High risk, high return sites are in red. So Chad, Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia. These are the places where our partners at ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, based in Nairobi, runs IBLI. So that is the home for IBLI. Those of you know a Kenyan PhD from here, 2005, I guess, Andrew Mude. Andrew is the IBLI guru. He's the guy who runs the thing. So this is all under Andrew's direction. We've just had the privilege at Cornell of being the main technical partners in the design work, the evaluation work, and a bunch of the outreach work. So those who want to know more about IBLI, just go to the ILRI website. There's an IBLI site. The takeaway is this index insurance is conceptually really attractive. In practice, very hard to design a good product. even the best designed products are highly imperfect, but even highly imperfect products can make a contribution in helping to stem collapses into poverty traps due to droughts. So far it's working. We hope that will continue. I'm happy to take questions with any remaining time.
Yeah, and